Hi, I am going to tell you a little bit about how I think about screen time at home and give you hopefully a really helpful way of addressing when and what and how and where and why to use screens at home. This is a small part of a larger class that I teach. This is the board from the class, so you can ignore everything that's up here. Um, but there's a few things that I want you to know first before I teach you this matrix. The first thing is about dopamine. What do we think of when we think of dopamine? We think of the feel good hormone, right? That's what I always thought of dopamine as a feel good hormone. Well, what we know from neuroscience is that dopamine is actually a motivating hormone. It is the hormone or neurotransmitter that tells you, hey, you're about to get something that you really, really, really need. Go get it. Dopamine showed up for us if we were walking through the desert and we saw a river. We'd be like, hey, go to that river and drink some water. Dopamine showed up for us when we were hunting and we heard like a little noise in the bush and we could go and hunt the animal. That's where dopamine shows up. It's this surge of excitement that's, hey, you're about to get something that you really need. That nuance is extremely important to know about when we're talking about our kids and screens. If we know that screens can help our can produce dopamine in our kids' brains, what that means is that screens don't make us feel good. If you've ever scrolled through Instagram for 3 hours before bed, you know you don't feel good after, but it makes us want to do it more. It shows us, hey, you're getting something you really, really, really need. So dopamine is a motivating hormone. It's a need-based hormone or neurotransmitter. It's not a feel-good hormone or neurotransmitter. Why that's important is because when we think of our kids with screens, we want them, if we see them in these high dopamine apps and we're like, hey, this feels good for them. I don't want to take away something that feels good, but it doesn't actually feel good. What it does is teaches them that they need more and more and more of it. Dopamine and these apps that produce really high dopamine change our brain chemistry to show us, hey, you're going to need more of this, you're going to need more of this, you're going to need more of this. Just like Tylenol, right, which is another drug that changes our kids' brain chemistry. And just like Tylenol, some families are cool with giving their kids Tylenol, many, many, many nights before bed to help them sleep if they're teething even a little bit. Some families don't give their kids Tylenol even if they're in extreme pain because they don't want to give their kid any drugs. And most of us fall somewhere in between, right? It's not to say that, oh, don't give your kids this drug, this thing that changes your brain chemistry. Tylenol is a drug. It changes your brain chemistry. It reduces the inflammation in your body. Just like that, dopamine and the apps that produce dopamine can be, we could call it a drug in that it changes your brain chemistry. And so just like other drugs, we want to be really conscious of when and how we use it. So now that you know actually what dopamine is briefly, and I can send you some resources to help explain it, in much further detail, but just knowing that it's a motivating hormone, not a feel good hormone, is a really important nuance so that we can give our kids the right supports with their screens. So we know that our kids are really, really motivated by them using their iPad. So us telling them, hey, I'm going to take away your iPad now. If they're in a really high dopamine state, which they likely are if they're playing high dopamine apps, if they're in a high dopamine state, they are hearing that like, hey, I'm going to take away your water now. That water that you use to drink and stay alive, I'm going to take that away right now. And that can be really stressful for our kids. So how do we calm that down? I want to teach you this matrix that I teach in my class that has helped a lot of the parents that I work with. So we have here, we have active versus passive screen time. And here we have alone versus together screen time. Not all, here, I'll move this, you can see, not all screens are created equal. Our kids talking to their friends on a video game that they have to really think critically in order to play and figure out strategy, right? Them being active and together playing a video game is very, very, very different than our kids being passive and alone watching YouTube video after YouTube video after YouTube video. So if we want our kids to have the lowest dopamine spike, the lowest I need that possible, then one way of thinking about screens can be giving our kids more screen use when they are able to communicate with someone else or that keeps them active. They might be communicating with someone else online, which sort of falls in here. They might be communicating with someone else in person, which sort of falls in here. Now, along with that, I do want to say that as a parent also, the reason why we give our kids screens more often than not is so that we could go do something else, right? We're not like, hey, let me sit with you and snuggle up with an iPad. No, we would do that with a book or do that with playing. But if we're like, hey, I need 20 minutes to make dinner, that's when we give them the screens. So I'm not saying that you always have to be together with your kid in order to have screen time, but you might choose to put them on a more active app if they're going to be alone. At least they're going to be alone doing something and having their brain thinking, as opposed to alone just passively consuming. So think about active versus passive and think about alone versus together when you're thinking about screen time. And I wonder if you want to let me know in an email or in the comments, you can tell me, where does your child fall more often with their screen time? I wonder if they fall more into this alone and passive quadrant, and if we might be able to shift it into the alone and active quadrant, or if they fall really into the alone and active quadrant, when you might be able to switch it into the active and together quadrant. And that might mean playing a game on FaceTime with their aunt or their grandparent. It doesn't always have to be you, but where can we give our kids more opportunities to be up here in order to curb that dopamine spike that comes from consumption and needing more and needing more and needing more? Because the more time there is to think in an app, the more your brain is like connected to itself, the more you're thinking. So I encourage you to think about this at home. And I hope you use this matrix to think about, where might I move my child into being together, either virtually or together in person with friends or family? And where might I move screen time into being just a little bit more active? If my child is watching YouTube alone, can you turn off autoplay so that they have to choose their next video? Even if my child is playing video games alone, might they be allowed to play video games with a friend, either virtually or in person? So think about using this matrix to really figure out what works for you with your screen time at home. And if you want further resources, I've got them. This is something that I teach in my class in much, much, much more detail, but I hope that this matrix helps you be able to take this and use it as you think about screen time with your child at home. Let me know how it goes.